The house sat at the very top of hill, far from the noise of the town below. At night, the long road leading up to it went completely dark, except for the soft glow from the mansion's windows. People in town used to stare up at that house and wonder what kind of life unfolded inside those walls. On the outside, it looked perfect, quiet, grand, untouched. But anyone who stepped through the doors could feel something else hiding beneath the calm. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was a weight in the air, like the moment before a storm when the wind stops moving and the world holds its breath. Inside that mansion, life ran on a tight schedule. Every morning, the cleaning staff arrived before sunrise. They moved quietly through the halls, careful not to disturb anything. They knew their positions, their duties, and the invisible lines they were never allowed to cross. Most of them had families of their own, but inside that house, they left their personal lives outside. The rooms were too large, the silence too sharp, and the tone from the people upstairs made everyone keep their heads down. One of the cleaners was a young woman who always walked with her arms close to her body, as if she was trying to protect something inside herself. She didn't talk much. She didn't complain. She worked hard, kept to herself, and stayed out of trouble. Everyone knew she had a baby, a quiet little boy who never cried around anyone else. Some days she brought him along when she had no one to watch him, and she'd keep him in a small carrier on her chest as she cleaned. He was dark-skinned like her, with wide, alert eyes that studied everything but rarely reacted. He didn't reach out to anyone. He didn't even smile at the other workers. He just clung to her, pressing his cheek against her chest whenever someone tried to get too close. At first, the others thought he was just shy. Bobbies had their own moods, their own fears, but time made it clear that it was something more. The child didn't want anyone else touching him, looking at him too long, or trying to hold him, except, strangely, for one person. The owner of the mansion. He wasn't often home, but his presence was always felt. People described him as a man who could fill a room even when he said nothing. He was older, tall, and had the kind of wealth that let him move through life without ever having to explain himself. In town, people admired him. Some were jealous. Others feared him in a quiet, unspoken way. He kept his world small, just his business partners, his staff, and a few people he trusted. He wasn't cruel, but something about him made people stand when he walked by. When he saw the cleaner's baby for the first time, he paused in a way that surprised everyone. His usual guarded expression softened just a little, like the sight of the child stirred something he didn't expect. The staff noticed, but no one dared mention it. The odd part was the child's reaction. The same baby who turned his face away from everyone else reached out to the millionaire without fear. His small hands lifted in quiet recognition, his eyes brightening for the first time. It was so sudden, so strange, that even the mother froze in place. She tried to hide the surprise on her face, but the staff exchanged glances behind her back. Bobbies didn't change their behavior like that unless there was something deeper going on. From that day on, whenever the millionaire was in the room, the child would twist in his mother's arms, trying to reach toward him. He would stare at him with a focus that didn't make sense. No crying, no fear. Just a strong pull, as if the man was the only person in the world he trusted besides his mother. The mother tried to act like it didn't bother her, but the way she held the baby told a different story. She kept her eyes down, avoided long conversations, and tried to stay out of the man's path. Yet the house was too big and too quiet to hide in for long. As days turned into weeks, small cracks began to show in the routines everyone depended on. Some workers whispered that the man seemed too interested in the baby. Others said the cleaner looked stressed, her movements sharper, her shoulders tense. She started showing up late, leaving early and avoiding places where the owner might be walking. When he asked her questions, she answered quickly and then moved away as fast as she could without being rude. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, that hinted at something darker pressing down on her. A trembling hand when she picked up a dropped bottle, a worried glance at her phone, a bruise she tried to hide with long sleeves. The other workers wanted to ask her what was wrong, but the rules of the house were clear. Personal matters stayed personal. No one pushed. Still, something in her eyes told a story she wasn't ready to speak. The mansion itself carried its own tension. Doors closed quietly when certain conversations started. Staff members stepped aside before voices rose. The millionaire's calm face didn't show anger often, but when it did, the entire house seemed to shrink back. There was power in every choice he made, even the kind ones. People didn't just follow him, they obeyed him, knowingly or not. And behind all of it, the child watched everything with wide, silent eyes. No one knew it then, but that strange connection between the millionaire and the baby was the first sign, the first quiet warning. the first shadow stretching out from a crime no one saw coming. Because the world inside that mansion wasn't as steady as it appeared. And the closer the mother tried to hold her life together, the closer everything began to slip from her hands. The days that followed the first strange connection between the baby and the millionaire seemed ordinary on the surface, but beneath the calm, a storm was quietly gathering. The mother tried to maintain her routines, cleaning the house with the same careful attention, keeping her voice low and polite, always moving just fast enough to avoid questions. But every time she caught the millionaire's gaze, a shiver ran through her. She told herself it was nothing, just a man curious about a child. But even as she said it, the tiny fingers gripping her shirt in her arms seemed to sense a tension she couldn't escape. The millionaire, for his part, began spending more time in the house than usual. Officially, he had business to manage, paperwork that needed his attention, but the staff quickly noticed that he lingered in the areas where the child was most often kept. At first, he spoke politely to the mother, asking innocuous questions about the baby's health, his habits, and what he liked to play with. But there was a subtle insistence in his tone, a quiet need that made anyone watching feel slightly off balance. He seemed to enjoy her presence in a way that no one else in the house had ever been made to feel. And though he smiled, it was a smile that never reached his eyes, leaving an edge beneath the charm. Other members of the staff started noticing the changes. The young woman who worked alongside the cleaner seemed nervous, avoiding hallways where the millionaire might appear. The butler, who had served the family for years, whispered to anyone who would listen about something not right in the way the man looked at the baby. No one dared speak directly, not because they weren't brave, but because of the invisible line of authority and power that hung over the house like a shadow. Yet the tension was contagious. The quiet hum of unease began to infiltrate even the most mundane moments. The cleaning of silver, the folding of linens, the simple act of walking down a hallway. The mother herself began to feel the pressure from every angle. Outside the mansion, her life was already complicated. Bills piled up despite her steady work, and her small apartment offered no sanctuary from the worries that followed her home. She had friends, but few she could truly confide in, and she feared gossip would spread if she revealed the unease she felt. At work, the millionaire's subtle obsessions collided with her fears. She could feel him watching her, waiting for moments when her attention faltered, moments when the baby reached for something he shouldn't. Each glance became a test, each question a trap. Slowly, the weight of his presence pressed down on her chest until even small tasks felt impossible to manage. It didn't take long for jealousy to creep in as well. Other members of the staff, particularly those who had grown fond of the baby or had their own children, whispered about the odd bond between the child and the millionaire. Some resented him quietly, noting how he could bend the mother to his attention with a look or a simple request. Others worried for her, seeing how small acts of kindness from the man were accompanied by subtle pressures, an expectation that the mother would comply, that she would allow her personal boundaries to erode. It was a tension that everyone felt, but no one could openly confront. Every interaction became a silent negotiation, every glance a measurement of control. Meanwhile, the mother's internal struggle intensified. She loved her son with a fierce, protective devotion, but she also felt the creeping anxiety of being watched, of being manipulated, of losing control. Some nights, she would sit in the darkened kitchen after work, rocking the baby and feeling an icy dread settle over her. She wondered how a man she barely knew could hold such power over her life, over her child. She thought about leaving, about seeking help, but the mansion's influence extended beyond its walls. In a town where people whispered but rarely acted, she knew she would face skepticism, judgment, and worse, questions she couldn't answer without revealing the fear that gripped her every day. The millionaire's obsession grew in subtle ways that were almost invisible to outsiders. He would leave gifts for the baby, expensive toys, clothes, items he claimed the child might enjoy. But the gifts were never casual. Each one seemed carefully chosen to draw attention, to create dependence. He asked questions about the baby's routines, about feeding and sleeping, about what made him cry. His interest was polite, almost clinical, but it carried an undercurrent that unsettled the mother. She noticed the pattern, the way he seemed to know exactly when to appear, the way he anticipated her movements. He was always present, always watching, always patient. But the patience itself had a tension, like the calm before a strike. The mother began to make small mistakes. Once she dropped a dish and froze when he appeared in the doorway, as if caught in a trap. Another time, she miscalculated the baby's feeding schedule and felt a quiet reprimand in his eyes, a disappointment she couldn't name. Each incident piled on top of the last, creating a weight she carried alone. Her hands shook as she cleaned. Her voice became sharper when speaking to other staff. She began to avoid looking up, to retreat into herself even more than before. Inside her, fear and anger battled with her natural maternal instincts. She wanted to fight, to flee, to scream, but the mansion's rules and the man's influence kept her silent. Other hidden stories within the house added to the pressure. Some staff members had grudges from the past, slight slights that became resentments, whispered complaints about favoritism or inequality. Some had been reprimanded unfairly, passed over for promotions, or made to work harder than others. These small grievances mingled with the tension surrounding the baby, creating an atmosphere where loyalty and fear were constantly tested. Staff began to question each other, to interpret harmless actions as threats. Small arguments escalated into icy silences. Doors slammed a little louder. Eyes darted around corners. Every movement was under scrutiny. Society outside the mansion contributed another layer of pressure. The town watched from a distance, its judgment subtle but suffocating. The millionaire was admired and feared. The mother, a black cleaning woman, moved through a world with fewer protections, fewer allies. She knew that anyone who challenged the millionaire too openly risked ridicule or reprisal. Her friends offered sympathy but little real support, and the closer she drew to others for advice, the more she feared that word of her troubles would reach the wrong ears. She carried her private anxiety alone, burdened by the economic and social reality of her situation. The baby, meanwhile, became a silent participant in the tension, his reactions intensifying it without intent. Whenever the millionaire entered a room, he would stiffen, focus, and sometimes reach for him, and the mother felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because her child trusted someone outside of her, and fear because the attention was not benign. She could sense the shift in the man's behavior, too. The soft smiles that lingered too long, the lingering touches on his toys, the way he observed the child with more than casual curiosity. It created a trap that tightened with each passing day. The rising pressure began to crack the of normalcy in other, smaller ways. Meals became tense, conversations awkward. Staff members began leaving early, claiming minor illnesses, as if the weight in the house was too heavy for anyone to bear. The millionaire's business meetings started to overlap with times when the child was present, forcing interactions that felt unnecessary but inevitable. The mother's exhaustion became visible, her patience thinner, her defenses weaker. Little mistakes became, small conflicts ballooned, and the quiet fear in the household became almost tangible. Every corner of the mansion seemed to carry an unspoken question: who would break first? And then there were the subtle manipulations, the questions that seemed innocent but weren't, the casual suggestions that nudged her toward compliance, the way the millionaire's eyes would follow her even when she tried to retreat. She caught herself imagining what might happen if she didn't follow the rules, if she didn't give him what he wanted. The thought itself made her stomach tighten. She didn't dare speak it aloud, not even to herself most days, but the fear that gnawed at her was constant. As tension built, the mother's mental state frayed. Moments of doubt and despair mingled with spikes of anger. She began planning, calculating, imagining scenarios where she could protect her child. At the same time, she feared the consequences of action. What might happen if she acted, if she resisted, if she tried to leave? The pressure created a sense of inevitability, as though a storm had already formed and all anyone could do was wait for it to break. Even the staff who weren't directly involved felt the unease. The house itself seemed to reflect the rising tension. Floors creaked differently, doors clicked open more loudly, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as if it knew that something was about to shatter. No one could put a finger on exactly what would happen, but everyone could feel it coming. Each day, the quiet dread grew, layering itself over the normal routines of cleaning, cooking, and tending to the baby. It was impossible to ignore. The calm of the mansion was cracking, and behind the walls, hearts were beating faster, minds were racing, and the line between ordinary life and disaster was disappearing. It was a household on edge, a fragile world poised on the edge of chaos, where every glance, every word, every small gesture pushed the situation closer to the point of no return. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible tension, the seeds of tragedy had already taken root. The rising action of the story was not a single moment, but a slow, relentless tightening, a pressure that would eventually explode, leaving no one untouched. The night it happened, the house felt different. Even before the first incident, the air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rain hammered against the windows, each drop drumming like a warning. The electricity flickered in the old fixtures, casting the rooms in shifting shadows, making familiar corners look like strangers. The baby had been unusually restless all evening, clinging to his mother, whining softly, his little hands gripping her arms as if he could sense what was coming. She felt it too, a dread she couldn't shake, a tightening in her chest that no amount of reasoning could dispel. The millionaire had been unusually quiet that night. His normal, calm, confident presence carried an edge, almost predatory. He wandered from room to room, lingering where the baby played, his gaze sharp, calculating. Something about the way he watched, the patience in his movements, made the mother's skin crawl. She tried to keep her distance, moving the baby from one room to another, hoping he would tire or lose interest, but the child's tiny body stiffened whenever the man entered the room. He reached for him instinctively, his eyes wide, unafraid, and the mother felt a shiver run down her spine. Tension had been building for weeks, and that night it finally snapped. The millionaire leaned down to hand the baby a small toy, a bright plastic rattle, but his hands lingered too long. The mother, exhausted, tense, and terrified, saw the way his eyes darkened, the way his smile faltered into something harder, possessive. Her mind raced, heart pounding. Every warning she had felt, the restless nights, the tightness in her chest, the subtle manipulations, suddenly screamed at her. She wanted to pull the baby away, to scream, to run, but the mansion's silence and the storm outside trapped her. The child, sensing her fear, whimpered and pressed closer into her chest. She tried to soothe him, rocking back and forth, whispering, but the millionaire's presence closed in, a shadow over her panic. Then in an instant he reached forward, not with a gift, not with a question, but with force. His hand was on the baby before she could react. Fear exploded inside her, raw and primal. She screamed, and the sound cut through the rain and the dark rooms. The baby shrieked, twisting in her arms, and she fought with every ounce of strength she had. The millionaire's expression flickered, shock, confusion, anger, before he gripped harder, trying to assert control. In that chaotic moment, time slowed. The mother's thoughts tumbled over one another: protect her child, survive, escape, fight. Her muscles burned with exertion, adrenaline blinding her. The millionaire, normally composed, seemed momentarily human, his calm replaced by a desperate, rigid determination. The baby's cries pierced the room, raw and unfiltered, cutting through the tension. And then it happened. A slip, a stumble, a moment of imbalance, and the world fractured. The mother's hands lost grip for just a second. The millionaire staggered back, knocking into a chair that toppled loudly. The baby cried louder, and in the frenzy of movement, the inevitable occurred. The sound, a sharp, gut-wrenching thud, echoed through the house. Time collapsed into a blur of screams, rain pounding, and frantic heartbeats. The aftermath was immediate and raw. The mother froze, her chest heaving, eyes wide with horror at what had just happened. The millionaire stared, his hand trembling, his mouth open but unable to speak. The baby was silent now, still and frighteningly small in her arms. Panic surged through her body, wild and unrelenting. She clutched him tightly, rocking, whispering his name, her mind racing for a way to undo what had just happened. The house seemed to respond to the chaos, doors creaking, the storm outside rattling windows. The staff, alerted by the screams, burst into the room, their faces pale and eyes wide. Questions collided with accusations, but no one spoke clearly. Everyone was caught in the visceral shock of the moment. Some tried to reach the baby, some tried to calm the mother, but the energy in the room was too chaotic, too raw. The millionaire's composure was shattered completely. He muttered excuses, fragments of explanations, each one more desperate than the last. His mind raced. How could this have happened? How could a moment of miscalculated action lead to this? He looked at the baby in disbelief, his own fear mingled with something darker. The realization that control, the thing he prized above all, had slipped away. The mother, heart-pounding, felt a mix of rage, grief, and sheer terror. She thought of what would come next, the whispers, the blame, the impossible questions from outside, the potential ruin of her life. And yet, through all of it, her maternal instinct refused to leave her child's side. She held him closer, rocking, murmuring, desperate for any sign of life, for a spark of reassurance, anything that might tell her he was still okay. The staff, unsure whether to call for help or try to intervene directly, hovered, frozen in a collective panic. No one knew what to do. The mansion, once a symbol of order and control, had become a theater of fear and chaos. The rain outside seemed to echo the tension within, hammering relentlessly as though the storm itself understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Minutes stretched endlessly. Every second was a drumbeat of panic and disbelief. The millionaire's hands shook as he reached toward the mother and child, hesitant, unsure, as though afraid his touch could make the situation worse. The mother, her eyes wet with tears, felt the weight of weeks of fear, tension, and oppression crash into a single, shattering moment. She understood in that instant that life as she had known it would never be the same. The first responders arrived hours later, though to the mother it felt like an eternity. The house, once pristine and orderly, was transformed into a chaotic scene of overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and lingering cries. Everyone involved carried their own scars, some visible, some buried deep inside. The millionaire, usually untouchable, now faced the raw consequences of an uncontrollable moment, staring at a reality that no amount of wealth or power could shield him from. The mother, exhausted and traumatized, clung to her child, the weight of survival and loss pressing down in ways she could never have imagined. The crime unfolded not with a planned sequence, but as a collision of fear, obsession, and human fragility. It was a perfect storm of psychological pressure, opportunity, and tragedy. And in the silence that followed, the echo of that night lingered, an invisible scar marking the beginning of a story that would haunt everyone involved, a moment where control, fear, and desperation converged into a singular, devastating act. The days after the incident were heavy and surreal. Inside the mansion, silence hung differently, like a living thing pressing down on everyone. The once-ordered routines of cleaning, cooking, and tending to the baby became hollow motions, as if the staff were moving through a fog. Some tried to act as though nothing had happened, pretending that the storm outside and the storm inside were unrelated. But no one could ignore the quiet tension that had replaced the familiar rhythms. Each glance, each footstep carried weight. The mother, her child clutched tightly to her chest, felt every heartbeat of the house like it was her own. Fear had not left her, it had. The millionaire moved through the rooms with a strange detachment. On the surface, he appeared composed, continuing to issue instructions and manage his business affairs, but there was a flicker behind his eyes that betrayed him. Guilt, panic, perhaps even disbelief took turns haunting him. He spoke carefully, as though weighing each word before it left his mouth, afraid that the wrong phrase could make everything unravel. In private, he stared at the walls, imagining scenarios that played over and over in his mind. What if someone had seen? What if the truth leaked? What if he lost control entirely? The man who had always commanded every room he entered now faced a vulnerability he had never known, one that no amount of money could erase. For the mother, the aftermath was a labyrinth of fear and exhaustion. She carried the baby everywhere, eyes constantly scanning for threats. Each small sound, the creak of a door, the hiss of the rain on the roof, the murmur of a staff member passing by made her flinch. Sleep became impossible. Her dreams, if she could call them that, were filled with frantic movement, the weight of unseen hands trying to take her child. The days blurred into one another. Eating, cleaning, and even speaking felt like a monumental effort. Her mind raced constantly, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for her family's future. She knew her life had been irrevocably changed, and no reassurance could bridge the gap between what had been and what now was. The baby, too young to articulate trauma, reflected it in subtle ways. He cried more, clung, and sometimes stared into empty spaces with an alertness that unsettled even seasoned staff. He sensed the tension in his mother, mirrored it in his reactions, and became a living symbol of the fragile balance that had been shattered. Every new face, every unexpected touch was met with instinctive fear. Only the mother could calm him, and even then it was a temporary relief that faded quickly. Outside the mansion, the ripples of the crime began to reach the town. The millionaire, once admired for his wealth, composure, and philanthropy, became a subject of hushed conversation and quiet speculation. People who had looked up to him now glanced sideways, wondering what had really happened inside those walls. The press began to dig, asking questions about the baby, the mother, and the circumstances that led to the tragedy. For the first time, the public saw cracks in the carefully constructed image of wealth and control. Admiration was replaced by suspicion, and in some cases, disdain. What had seemed untouchable now appeared fragile, and the reality of human fallibility became a story that traveled faster than the rain downhill. Legal proceedings loomed, casting another shadow. Investigators combed through the mansion, speaking to staff, gathering evidence, and piecing together timelines. Every recollection, every hesitant admission became part of a larger narrative that the mother had no control over. The millionaire, used to commanding situations with certainty, now found himself at the mercy of questions he could not fully answer. The courtroom, or even the threat of one, became another site of tension, an inescapable reminder that wealth did not equal immunity. Public perception and legal reality collided, leaving both mother and millionaire navigating a world where fear and judgment had replaced the protective illusion of power. Within the mansion, relationships shifted subtly but irrevocably. Staff members who had been loyal now moved cautiously, unsure of alliances and intentions. Some tried to distance themselves, claiming obligations elsewhere. Others whispered about what they had witnessed, about the uneven power dynamics, about the dangers of remaining in the house at all. Even the butler, who had served faithfully for decades, looked at the millionaire with a mix of wariness and disbelief. The house that had once been a symbol of order became a cage of tension, where every glance carried questions and every word could be interpreted as an accusation. Emotionally, the toll was profound. The mother's sense of security had vanished entirely. She felt guilt even where none was hers, wondering if she had misjudged signs, mismanaged moments, or failed to protect her child. The millionaire's guilt mingled with denial, a dangerous combination that allowed him to continue outwardly normal behaviors while his mind churned with fear and self-recrimination. Both were prisoners of the night's events, trapped in psychological labyrinths that would continue to haunt them long after the physical danger had passed. Even beyond the immediate family, the community felt the effects. Friends and relatives offered sympathy, but it was often tinged with caution. People worried about reputations, about gossip, about the way society would judge them if they associated too closely with a household now known for tragedy. The baby's innocence, once a symbol of joy, became a quiet reminder of fragility and vulnerability. Conversations at the grocery store or in schoolyards carried an undertone of tension, as if everyone had witnessed the unspoken trauma without ever seeing it directly. The mansion itself remained, unchanged in structure but forever altered in atmosphere. The rooms held memories, the air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed longer. Every creaking floorboard, every echoing hallway reminded those inside of the night when chaos had entered their lives. The house was no longer a place of order, but a container of tension, grief, and fear. Slowly, the mother began to take tentative steps forward, driven by the need to care for her child. She started small, venturing outside the mansion grounds, trying to reclaim a sense of control over her life. But the psychological scars remained, each step forward shadowed by memories of panic, helplessness, and the overwhelming intensity of that night. The millionaire, too, was left to confront himself, facing questions he had never anticipated, learning that the illusion of control could crumble in a single moment. The aftermath, though quieter than the chaos of the night itself, carried its own weight. It was a landscape of emotional turmoil, fractured trust, and the slow, grinding realization that life had shifted irreversibly. For the mother, the millionaire, and the community around them, every day became a negotiation with memory, fear, and the unpredictable consequences of human actions. The crime had ended in a single violent instant, but its echoes reverberated endlessly, reshaping lives and perceptions in ways no one could have predicted. In the months that followed, the mansion on Hill never returned to its previous quiet grandeur. The mother and her child moved into a small apartment in town, a modest place that carried the faint echo of safety and normalcy, yet it could not erase the shadow of the past. She carried the memory of that night everywhere, in the way her son sometimes flinched at sudden movements, in her own restless nights, and in the lingering doubt that even now someone, or something, could take control from her again. The trauma had become a part of daily life, subtle but unrelenting, a reminder that even after escape, fear could linger long after danger had passed. The legal consequences for the millionaire unfolded in a series of hearings that drew public attention. Once a symbol of power and untouchable influence, he found himself under scrutiny in ways he had never imagined. Witnesses recounted events, statements were cross-checked, and evidence meticulously examined. The courts were methodical, yet public opinion was merciless. Media coverage painted him as a man whose wealth and authority had blinded him to the vulnerability of those around him, and society watched with a mixture of fascination and judgment. In the end, the legal system delivered its verdict. The millionaire faced criminal charges, though the details were debated endlessly in the press. Whether justice was fully served became a matter of personal interpretation, but one fact remained indisputable. His life, reputation, and sense of control were irreversibly fractured. For the mother, survival meant more than avoiding harm. It meant reclaiming her own sense of agency. She returned to work as soon as she could, her steps cautious, her voice quiet but steady. The baby, now older, continued to carry traces of the trauma, a subtle wariness in his reactions, but his bond with his mother remained unbroken. She learned to navigate the lingering anxiety, slowly building a life that could shield him from the chaos of the past. Yet the shadow of that night followed them, shaping choices, relationships, and even the quiet routines of everyday life. What had begun as a moment of fear and helplessness evolved into an enduring vigilance, a careful choreography between protection, independence, and recovery. The community around Hill also bore the echoes of the crime. The mansion, once a symbol of aspiration and prestige, became a place associated with tragedy, whispered caution, and social reflection. People discussed not only the incident itself, but the power dynamics that allowed it to happen. Questions arose about wealth, influence, and the vulnerability of those without resources or social standing. The story became a lens through which society examined its own moral structures, questioning assumptions about privilege, control, and how authority can be misused or misunderstood. Conversations once polite and neutral now carried weight, and the narrative of the house and its inhabitants became a warning, a lesson, and a point of reflection for those who observed it from outside. The psychological toll on those directly involved lingered, shaping their perspectives on trust, human behavior, and relationships. The millionaire, confined by both public judgment and self-reflection, came to understand that wealth and influence could never fully shield one from the consequences of action or inaction. Power, he learned, was fragile, easily corrupted, and potentially devastating when wielded without awareness or restraint. The mother, meanwhile, discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed, a capacity for protection, vigilance, and recovery that carried her and her child forward into a life that, while changed, was still capable of hope. Looking at the broader themes, the story underscored the fragility of morality when intersecting with power. The mansion had been a microcosm of societal hierarchies, wealth, and control. It showed how easily authority can blur boundaries, exploit trust, and obscure the humanity of those considered beneath someone in social or economic standing. The crime itself, born of tension, obsession, and misjudgment, illustrated the complex interplay between human emotion and ethical responsibility. Each action, each decision, carried consequences far beyond immediate perception, leaving permanent imprints on lives, relationships, and society at large. In the end, justice was not a simple matter of verdicts or punishments. It existed in layers: the legal resolution that held the millionaire accountable, the mother's reclamation of agency, and the child's survival as a testament to resilience. It existed in the quiet lessons absorbed by the community, in conversations about morality, trust, and vigilance. And it existed, quietly but persistently, in the memories of those who had lived through that night, forever aware of how a single moment could fracture lives, shift power, and leave lasting traces on the human psyche. The story closed not with relief but with reflection. It reminded everyone involved, and everyone who would hear it later, that human behavior is intricate, that fear and desire, power and vulnerability, morality and corruption are never neatly separated. Lives are shaped by the intersections of choice and circumstance, by the weight of influence, and by the quiet truths that lie beneath appearances. In the quiet that remained, after legal battles, after public scrutiny, after grief and recovery, the mansion's shadow lingered, a reminder that even the most controlled worlds can collapse in a single night, and that from that collapse, both suffering and understanding can emerge.